The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today. Well, hello, and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm having to look over a puddle of poodle to get to you, but here I am, Father Nathan, and my assistant, apparently the star of the show today, Toto. We're recording this episode of the podcast on the Tuesday of what we call the fifth week of Lent. This coming weekend, we move into Palm Sunday, and then a week from today, we are in Holy Week, leading up to Easter. So I'm right now staying 1 week ahead in the recording of these podcasts. So this one that I'm doing today will be live and available to you on Tuesday of Holy Week. And then the third in this trilogy will be the Tuesday right after Easter. So I really like the timing of it because the topic and the wonderful human being who is the central character in the story. Last week we began this trilogy that is we gave him he chose a name. We didn't use his real name because he wanted to keep that concealed a bit. If you recall, we're calling him John the Baptist. He was a pastor of a small rural southern church that had Baptist in the title of its name, although it wasn't affiliated with any other churches. It was an independent church, but it had Baptist in its name. It was a small congregation, small enough that it rarely had the occasion to baptize a new member, but once in a while it did. And when that occasion arose, it was cause of celebration, and they would inform everybody the week ahead of time that next Sunday, instead of meeting at the church, we're going to meet down by the river. And there was a place that everyone was familiar with where the water was rather shallow and ran still enough that it was safe to step into for baptizing. There was enough of a clearing in the woods for people to park, and after the baptism would become the primary focus of that weekend's service, then they'd have a picnic. Well, the pastor, whom we're calling John the Baptist, uh, really thought that that was his favorite place in the world, and he felt most alive uh, and most engaged in his faith when he was baptizing in the river. So that was always a peak experience for him. We mentioned last time his story is in Afterlife Interrupted, Book 2. We told his story last week that he drowned in that place. He didn't understand while he was drowning what was going on around him, but in brief, a man who would sometimes come to church, but when he did, he would come by himself, asked the pastor, could we meet down by the river for some counsel? So, so John said, well, that wasn't uncommon, and men have their own way about them when they seek advice of a pastor. They agreed to meet there. They each drove there in their trucks, and they were both leaning against the side of their trucks with a little distance between them. And he said, sometimes that's the way men start things. They want a little space. And then at one point in the conversation, the other man said, would you come over here, please? I have something I'd like you to see in the back of my truck. So John went across and bent to look over into the bed of the truck, and the man hit him, not enough to make him unconscious, but enough to daze him, he said, tied him up, and put him in the water. And even though he was going to drown him in a crime that would be murder, he wanted it to look like it could have been accidental. So he had him, when he was semi-conscious or mostly unconscious, he stuck his hand through a board that had a hole in it that he said might have been a part of an old door to make it look as though maybe there was an accidental drowning and he was trying to save himself, but did not. Anyway, complicated story. It gets more complicated because the man who did this thing was actually having an affair with John's wife, with the pastor's wife. He was just clueless about that. That catches you up to the basic outline of the story, which you can read in full detail in his own words in Afterlife Interrupted, Book Two. So, in these trilogies, we first tell a story, which we did last week, and in the part two, we move into what I call compassionate response to that story. What does it evoke, first of all, in me and in you? Anybody hears and reads about it, especially when people give me feedback about what they thought about a story. We go into this, what will be this episode's theme, compassionate response to his story. And then next week, we'll go into what I call spiritual practice, something that moves more into prayer or meditation, or at least how to think in a different way about a thing spiritually after hearing a story. We'll do that next week. But I've prepared a few thoughts for a compassionate response to the tragic story of John the Baptist. You can't get away from the fact that it's a tragic story. The man was in a marriage that he thought was stable and happy. Um, he thought he was going out that day to help another human being who sought his counsel, and he ended up being the victim of a murder. Well, that's just tragic, isn't it? Except that in the way that John spoke about what happened to him, he didn't color the story with a lot of tragic overtones. He pretty much told the details of it without embellishment. When he spoke of his wife and of the man who did this to him, he didn't add um, emotional adjectives. He stayed with nouns and verbs. This person and that event. I learned to do that early in my career in priesthood because sometimes when we want to tell a story that we have an emotional engagement with and that might have offended us, it's very easy to move into descriptors that are loaded emotionally and maybe not necessary to tell the story to another person in a dispassionate way. I learned how to write emails and how to write something that would land on the bishop's desk or perhaps in the paper that didn't disclose a whole lot of emotional prejudice of my own. Toto's going to assist from over there on the bed. I'm in the guest room at my friend's house where I stay, and he's going to stay over there and watch. Compassionate response to what happened to John. First of all, I think I would like to start with the idea that um, he chose a wise option for himself that didn't make his sufferings even worse than they already were. Because we can do that. We can not only experience a thing that was tragic or hurtful, but we can re-experience it and play it over again in ways that keep it alive and don't let it just be a past event, but keep it something that we're churning about and so on. Thinking of how, have you ever had a canker sore in your mouth? Some little thing in there that's sore for a little while? And how when I get one of those, I haven't had one in a while, but when I do, it's hard to keep your tongue from going to that spot over and over again. Got to feel it one more time. Sentir in Spanish means to feel. It's related to sense, and to resent means to feel again. But often, resentment in English has to do with feeling a thing again, so that you can feel worse about it than you did the last time you thought about it. It's what isn't only bad enough that you said or did that thing towards me, but now I'm going to feel it again, play it back in my mind, arouse my emotions about it yet again, maybe for the hundredth time, and resent you for what you did. Well, that's always an option. It's like sometimes our emotions boss us around and we feel that we're powerless to do anything about it, that I just resent this person with no sense of me being the person in charge of my thoughts and emotions. Well, uh, good luck with that. I'd like you to be happy. I didn't call this podcast The Joyful Friar for no reason. I try to guard that kind of thinking. It's not that I don't have it. When I have a thought that can move towards resentment, I try to catch myself and I ask my guardian angel to help with it. And you help me choose whether I want to go down that path in my own thoughts, even if I don't express them out loud, or not. Must I really think about that offense that happened earlier in the week and replay it and get angry about it again and sad and then maybe moved toward not only resentment but maybe retribution? Well, John the Baptist had plenty of material to work with if he'd wanted to do that. His wife had betrayed him uh, with infidelity. There might have been a conversation that she was involved in about getting rid of him so that the two of them could run off and build a life together. And then the man murdered him. John the Baptist had plenty to be resentful about if he wanted to do that. He had about himself the wits, even as he moved from bodily embodied consciousness into what he called being dazed. Then he was aware that he was out of body and could see his body floating toward a culvert where he thought, this is where I'll die. And he did. Then he was in an out of body consciousness that he called being groggy. He compared it, or maybe I'm the one that brought this to it, the grogginess, the way that a person might come out of anesthesia after a surgery and be momentarily aware of the fact that, oh, I'm awake, I'm alert. Maybe somebody offers you a sip of water, but you fall back asleep. And then maybe as you come out of the anesthesia or without have ever caused the grogginess, fatigue, you begin to be more and more alert and aware and remain that way. Well, um, he described his consciousness as he left the body and where he landed, but then he said, when I landed here and as I became um, aware and awake for longer periods of time, he was aware that he was being well cared for by people he didn't know, the way that we would if we were in well, even in a hospital where it wasn't an emergency. Perhaps you had a scheduled surgery, but the shifts change every 8 hours, and as you're sleeping and waking, you might not be clear right away on who it is at your bedside, who it is that's offering you that sip of water. Well, he became aware that he had a team of people in the afterlife who were taking good care of him and he could relax. He didn't need to stay in an agitated state that he could have after having been murdered. He just relaxed. He allowed himself to be cared for by caring people. I think that's a possible response that could possibly help somebody who's hearing or seeing this podcast. If you continue to stay agitated about something, do you have another option? Can you receive the compassionate response of people around you who are trying to help and let that be enough? I might be asking a lot, but could you let that be enough? Could you just be in this moment and not the prior one? Could you stay in this moment and receive the gift of this moment and not go back into the event that might be so upsetting? That's what John did. He was cared for by different people, all of whom did were kind to him and provided some sort of support. There came a point at which he asked, he said, I know that I have died. Now, I used to teach people about what it would be like to die and live after your death. He loved Jesus and was a follower of Jesus. And he knew that Jesus had died um, a very violent public death at the hands of people who killed him. So he said, we have that in common. We both died young and healthy because somebody wanted us to die and killed us. Uh, he said, but Jesus didn't linger in that event or return to it. Um, it said, the gospel said he died, and 3 days later he rose. And so John the Baptist was saying, I know that that's the pattern. If you follow Jesus, that's the way it works. It moves from the tragic thing to the glory of Easter morning relatively quickly if you're just patient. He said, that's what I wanted to be. He also uh, remembered Bible stories about Jesus on Easter morning and in the days and weeks that followed, appearing to people that had betrayed him, said they never knew him, um, if you the latter chapters of the Gospels have some stories, and so does the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles, about different apparitions of the risen Christ. And he said, when he did have an opportunity to speak to or be with people he loved who had momentarily betrayed him, he didn't hold their feet to the fire. He just said, "Peace be with you. Peace be with you." And he said, "That's what I want to do. I want to offer everyone peace." He said, "I was a preacher, and I know that in order to preach the good news, it has to live in you. And I want to be that way." So that was a decision of his that came from a habitual way of life that, if it isn't yours already, I would encourage you to consider it, of believing that things can turn from terrible to wonderful relatively soon without necessarily a long, slow slog back to peace. If you're in deep grief, I hope you don't think that the best you can hope for is some tiny incremental, almost indiscernible improvement over time, and that most of what you'll experience is just unrelenting pain. I hope that you won't construct your future world that way, because you can make that a self-fulfilling prophecy. I try to be a person of joyful hope and proclaim it. One of the things that I think John the Baptist was so good at is, even though his afterlife experience didn't match what he thought it would be, he allowed it to be. He had a favorite hymn, it's Everlasting Arms of Jesus. And the idea is that in suffering, that we can lean in and allow the everlasting arms of Jesus to enfold us and even carry us, like those images of the lost sheep, where the shepherd, who might be Jesus, is carrying the lamb over his neck, on his shoulders. He thought that that would be that believers in Jesus, that that's the first thing they would see when they died, was that. Somebody had taught him that, and he had kind of enshrined that particular idea in his imagination. And then it didn't turn out that way. He did die in a sudden violent way, but he was groggy. And then he had these people who were sort of like a hospital staff that were helping him. But finally, he said to one of them, "Wait a minute, you've all been so nice, but when am I going to see Jesus? When is my expectation going to match the reality?" Well, somebody said to him, "Well, do you remember that after Jesus died, he sent the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit entered every person who was receptive? Spirit means breath, and you've got holes in your face that can allow in breath. It's not difficult. You can breathe in the presence of the crucified and risen Christ." That's the what language I would use. Um, and he said, "Oh yeah." And he said, "When once you do that, once he's inside you, then he looks like you. Once he's inside me, he looks like me. And in the community of believers, he begins to look like each of us because he's inside each of us." Not a difficult idea, is it? He said, "They had to take me back to Christian preschool. It's not that I didn't know this, and they didn't even teach it to him like he was stupid, or that they were giving him information he had never heard of. They were reminding him, which is a really gentle, respectful way to teach. A teacher isn't always imparting new information, although sometimes they do, but many times they're building upon something that's within you already, and say, because you know this, perhaps you've already heard this, but here's the next thing that builds upon what you already know. That was his experience. So he went, "Oh, yeah, 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 I'm already in the presence of Jesus." But then they said, "However, if you'd like to see that version of him that's in your imagination with the toga and the sandals and the beard, we'll get you ready for that." And that can be delightful, don't you think? When something that you envision in imagination turns out to be exactly like it matches exactly the thing that you envisioned. Have you ever cooked? When you're a cook, you imagine what the finished meal is going to look like. And that might be tricky because you need to get the potatoes and the salad on the table, and you need to get the the meat, the potatoes, the vegetable, all of them to come out and be fully cooked and hot at the right time. Maybe there's rolls in the oven. That's one of the challenges. I love to cook, and Easter's coming. I'll be doing a bunch of cooking. But sometimes it's very satisfying when you look up from your own food and you watch the loved ones around you enjoying their meal and the not just the food, but the experience of each other. And you can quietly look up from it and go, wow, this is exactly what I wanted to have happen. This is perfect. Um, that happened to me just last week. I had two high school friends that who are probably watching the podcast who came to visit me, and they're both women my age who were in my high school graduating class who enjoy shopping. And there's a town not far from Tucson called Tubac that's an artist colony. It has lots of things. Many of them are, too expensive to just walk into a store and purchase a lot of framed art and stuff. Um, but not everything. A lot of it was clothing and jewelry and um, kitchenware, different things. And we spent most of the day going in and out. And then we had a nice surprise that a lot of the people who work in these places, especially the galleries, don't have a lot of people to talk to. If you sit in a gallery that has a lot of really fine art in it, you might be by yourself part of the time. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing it up is because I think they would like that. And it was just far enough away that it was a convenient day trip, and it was out in the countryside, and it was a day that had a little bit of rain and wind and stuff. And in the desert here, we don't get very much rain. So anyway, the day matched my idea of what it might be, and so it was very gratifying. Well, back to John the Baptist, he had this idea in his head that would have delighted him that Jesus would hold him in the everlasting arms. And they said, we'll get you ready for that because that would be delightful. So I really enjoyed that part. Um, One thing about compassionate response is the people who cared for him. I might go into that more in next weekend's uh, episode. They're usually, in my experience, a mixture of humans who have died, who once lived upon the earth, but who have died. And very often they were people who were first responders or nurses or in some sort of helping, nurturing uh, vocation, occupation, who, at least for part of their eternal afterlife, want more of that. In the Catholic tradition, we have saints, and they're often made the patron or patroness of the thing that they did the most of or were most famed for in their lifetime here. A teacher becomes the patron of teachers, and a firefighter becomes the patron of firefighters. Well, people can continue to love the thing that they used to love and do, and have an afterlife application of it somehow, a way of that being a thing that they continue to do. Well, so the afterlife team that was helping him was his guardian angel at the very least, and probably other angels and humans, all in tandem, and the Holy Spirit of God and all of them. It's really a lovely kind of being surrounded, maybe being embraced in the everlasting lasting arms, just as they're embodied in a group. So he had a compassionate response team was one thing. Um, when he thought about the betrayal that was his that was that brought about his death, he thought about it, um, and then he said, my wife and I married young, and we'd not had sex with anybody else. We learned about sex with each other. And he said, I never thought, it never crossed my mind that she would be unfaithful. But when he described that, he described it dispassionately, just as a sequence of events. And then he said something like, sometimes people get swept up. I think that was his phrase. Sometimes people just get swept up, and before they know it, they're in a circumstance that they should have avoided. But it wasn't harsh. It wasn't judgmental of his wife. He just said she might have gotten swept up. Um, they he indicated to his care team that he might want to know more about that, and they said, not yet. That's there's a lot of emotion in that story, and you're not ready for it yet. And he accepted that and went on. I wonder if you do that for yourself, because that can be a practice of self-compassion. There might be something in your life that is open-ended and that needs your attention at some point, but it might be too raw, too fresh, too painful, and you might not yet have the dispassionate command of your own faculties to move into that material. And even when you begin to, you might not be capable of doing that on your own. It might be something that really needs trained, skilled listener, a therapist or counselor or somebody to help you think it through. Well, he accepted when they said, "No, you're not ready for that yet, but we'll let you know." Timing can be important in compassionate response to others and to ourselves. Sometimes people around us are suffering, and we just want to make them stop suffering. And so we want to choke them and say, stop suffering, or we want to boss them around. And, that doesn't work. People need to have the freedom to move at their own pace and not be made to feel shame that they are not feeling the way you want them to feel because you want them to get over something. Anyway, he accepted the fact that it wasn't timely and he just let that aside. That might be helpful to you. There could be something that is unresolved in your life that you wish were resolved, but it might not be time for it. Sometimes in my own life, I have all these busy things that I do, like podcasts, but I also need to do the laundry, or I need to sweep, or I need to grocery shop, or whatnot. And sometimes I try to make myself do the things that require concentration in the morning hours because I'm an early riser and some of my best creative energy and productivity is in the morning or the early afternoon. And then I'll allow myself to do the laundry later or whatnot. Sometimes it's just an ordering, figuring out where your energy is and how it should be made available to whatever needs doing. He looked at when he was told, no, you don't have the energy for that yet. He just said, okay, I don't. So that was okay. It wasn't a bad thing. It was just something that will happen later. Um, there's one more thing that I want to make this point. Um, that one of the things that ways that he was compassionate and I think wise in dealing with the manner of his death was he didn't immediately move away to the option of what I call the separate self. He didn't enter the afterlife raging and saying, "What the hell?" You know, uh, he didn't blame his killer or his wife or God that this happened to me, and after all, I am the most important thing to me. He could have done that, and no one could have really begrudged him, but he didn't. He thought of himself as belonging to Jesus. He began to see patterns between the manner of his death and Jesus's own death. He waited in hope that things would turn. He received the help of people around him, and he didn't try to contradict them. When they told him things, he received their counsel and said, "Oh, okay." He had a humility about him. But one of the ways I was thinking about that is in the word "you" in the English language uh, can be singular. If you're the only other person in the room with me, and I say, "Would you come over here, please?" You is intended to, it's a singular pronoun. I want you to come to me. Um, and if there were two of you or three of you across the room and I said, "Would you please come over here?" You'd probably pick up from context that I either looked one of you right in the eye and was meant you singular, or I was thinking collectively, and I want you all to come over here. I grew up in Texas where we say, "Would y'all come over here?" Well, you all, which is the contraction of y'all, makes it clearer in English that I'm thinking plurally. I'm using the word you, but I put the word all or y'all to make it plural. In much of the history of the world, people thought of themselves first as part of the whole, and only secondarily as an individual within the whole. I'm going to repeat that. For much of human history, cultures, societies, persons within them first thought of themselves as being a part of the whole, then as an individual unit within it. Sometimes I know the scriptures well, especially the New Testament, and both the Greek and Hebrew languages that our scriptures are written in, neither one of them has a word for cousin, in part because the particularity of how that child relates to other children and fits into this network was a secondary thought. They're just children because they belong to the clan, to the group. Yes, they knew who went home with who at the end of the day, who was mama and daddy, but linguistically they didn't even note that. They were just children. They were brothers and sisters to each other, and they didn't weren't so particular about those relations. I think I think it was during the Enlightenment, maybe somewhere in Western history, at least in the what would it be, the 15, 16, 1700s, that movement towards individualism came into play. And I think in the West remains a dominant way of thinking that first of all, I singular am me. Secondarily, I am a part of a family or a nation or a religious body, but I individually am the active agent of my existence in my life. Well, had John the Baptist moved that way, it might have been more difficult for him. But his instinct, his action was to think of himself as part of a belonging system, especially to Jesus, but also to the people that were assisting him in his new afterlife world. And then after that, he went toward his distinctiveness, his individuality within the group. As an American, our national holiday is July the 4th, Independence Day. I say this repeatedly because it's so important. I wish the next day, the 5th or maybe the 3rd, would be Interdependence Day because those things are breathing in and breathing out. They're yin and yang. They belong as part of a whole. And I think sometimes in the United States, we can put so much emphasis on my individual rights that we think that that's where everything needs to begin and end with me and my opinion and my ego. And it just doesn't need to be that way. It makes us lonely and unhappy when we do that. So I think John had a compassionate sense of how he fit into a network. And even though some of it wasn't um, functioning as quite the way he expected it to, he could set aside his ego and say, well, I thought it was going to be this, but in fact, it's that. And he did that without disappointment, only with curiosity. Sometimes we can be spoiled children the day after Christmas that we wanted this and we got that. And now I feel deprived because I didn't get this. Well, well, then go ahead and be unhappy the day after Christmas if you want, but I want you to be joyful. I hope you can figure out a way to say, you know what, I want to be grateful for what I have while I have it, and then I'll be try to be receptive to the next thing and the next person and the next one after that. And in the meanwhile, I'll try to be of service to the group that I'm a part of, which claims me as its own. This is me signing off. This is Father Nathan, reminding you that I pray for you regularly. When I do, I pray for healing wherever in you that there might be uh, something unhealed, some residue of something in the past that lingers that you wish didn't. That's the way I like to pray for you. If it would be interesting to you to engage me one-on-one, you can do that through my website, nathan-castle.com. I do ask that you read at least the first of the three Afterlife Interrupted books to get a better feel in case you've found me on this or another website, on another podcast. Uh, I'd like to be able to talk with you at a more informed level, which would help if you'd read one of the books. But anyway, that's it for now. So this is Father Nathan Castle. Thank you for being with me on this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. God bless you. Bye bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.